library was my favourite place in the world. It wasn't just the quiet hum or the soft scent of aging paper and binding glue. It was the feeling of possibility held within every book on every shelf. My job here, at our small community library, felt less like work and more like tending to a garden of stories. Most days passed in a pleasant rhythm, helping Mrs. Davis find her large print mysteries, showing teenagers how to use the research databases, or simply sharing a quiet smile with someone lost in a book. My colleague, Ben, made the days even brighter. We worked well together, sharing shifts at the front desk, organising returned books, and occasionally whispering jokes when the library was especially quiet. Ben had a quick laugh and a knack for finding the funny side of things, even when we faced a mountain of reshelving. "Teamwork makes the dream work, Maya," he'd often say, grabbing a stack of books with a grin. I trusted him, and I thought he felt the same way about me. We were a good team, keeping our little library running smoothly. That afternoon started like any other Tuesday. The sunlight streamed through the tall windows, dust motes dancing in the beams. I was sorting through a pile of new arrivals when a man I didn't recognise approached the counter. He was quiet, perhaps a little shy, and held a small cloth-wrapped package. "This is a donation," he murmured, placing it carefully on the counter. "It's quite old. For the library's collection, if you want it." Before I could ask his name or thank him properly, he gave a quick nod and hurried out the door. Curiosity piqued, I unwrapped the package. Inside was a beautiful, leather-bound book. Its cover was worn smooth in places, the title embossed in faded gold letters. It looked genuinely old and possibly valuable. A thrill went through me. Donations like this were rare and exciting. I placed it carefully on the edge of the counter, making a mental note to show it to our manager, Mrs. Evans, as soon as possible. It needed to be properly catalogued and perhaps even appraised. Just then, Mrs. Gable, one of our regulars, waved me over from the local history section. "Maya dear, could you give me a hand? I can't quite reach that book on the top shelf," she called, her voice frail but cheerful. "Of course, Mrs. Gable," I replied instantly. Helping patrons was the best part of my job. I glanced back at the valuable book on the counter. It was quiet. No one else was nearby. It would only take a minute. I walked over to the history aisle, retrieved the book Mrs. Gable wanted, and chatted with her for a few moments about her grandson's school project. She gathered her pile of checked-out books, thanked me warmly, and headed towards the exit. Feeling pleased I could help, I walked back to the front desk. My eyes immediately went to the spot where I had left the donated book. It was empty. My heart gave a strange little jump. Empty. That couldn't be right. I scanned the countertop, thinking I must have moved it without realising. Maybe I'd pushed it aside. No, nothing. I checked the shelf beneath the counter, then quickly looked on the floor. My breath caught in my throat. The book was gone. It had only been maybe 3 minutes, 4 at most. Just as a wave of confusion and worry washed over me, the staff room door opened and Ben walked out, stretching. "Ready for the afternoon rush?" he asked cheerfully. Then his eyes fell on the empty counter space where I was still looking. "What's up, Maya? Looking for something?" donation, I said, my voice sounding a little thin. That old book someone just dropped off. It was right here. Now it's gone. Ben's smile faded. He stepped closer. Gone? What do you mean, gone? Are you sure you didn't put it somewhere? Maybe in the back office already? No, I insisted, shaking my head. I left it right here while I helped Mrs. Gable for a minute. I came back and it wasn't here. Ben frowned, his usual easy-going manner replaced by concern. Are you absolutely sure, Maya? It looked valuable. You didn't take it to Mrs. Evans? No. I didn't move it, I repeated, a knot tightening in my stomach. Why did he keep asking if I had moved it? I was only gone for a few minutes. That's strange, Ben said, his eyes scanning the desk again, then looking towards the library entrance, then back at me. Really strange. A valuable book just vanishing like that. He didn't accuse me, not directly, but his tone, the slight furrow in his brow, the way he avoided meeting my eyes for more than a second. It felt heavy. It felt like a question hanging in the air between us. Suddenly, the familiar comfort of the library felt different. A cold trickle of unease ran down my spine. He was worried about the book, of course, but it felt like he was also worried about me. It was just a feeling, a shadow of doubt that flickered in his eyes, but it was enough to make my own trust waver, not in him, but in how he saw me. The beautiful old book was missing, and somehow a shadow had fallen over the simple clarity of our workday friendship. Where had the book gone? And why did I suddenly feel like I had to prove I hadn't taken it? The questions echoed in the quiet library air. The rest of that Tuesday felt heavy. The familiar quiet of the library no longer seemed peaceful. It felt tense, charged with unspoken questions. Every time the front door opened, I jumped, half expecting the anonymous donor to return, or worse, someone official asking about the missing book. I tried to focus on my tasks, checking books in, answering questions, but my mind kept circling back to the empty space on the counter and Ben's troubled expression. Working alongside Ben became uncomfortable. The easy chatter we usually shared disappeared. He seemed preoccupied, organising shelves with a focused intensity that felt unnatural. When our paths crossed near the copier, I tried a small smile. Busy day, I commented, hoping to break the tension. He nodded curtly, not quite meeting my eyes. Yeah, need to make sure everything's accounted for. Accounted for. The words landed like small stones in my stomach. Was that aimed at me, or was I just being overly sensitive? My rational side told me he was probably just stressed about the missing valuable item, but the seed of doubt planted earlier was starting to sprout, twisting into anxiety. Later, I needed a file from the small office behind the main desk. The door was slightly ajar, and I heard voices inside. Ben and our manager, Mrs. Evans. I stopped, not wanting to interrupt, but I couldn't help but catch snippets of their conversation. Just vanished, Mrs. Evans, Ben was saying, his voice low and serious. Maya said she left it right on the counter when she went to help Mrs. Gable, and no one else was around, Mrs. Evans asked. Not that she saw, but it's just gone. A book like that. Ben trailed off. My cheeks flushed hot with a mixture of embarrassment and hurt. He was talking about me, about what I told him. It wasn't exactly an accusation, but hearing him report it like that made me feel like a suspect in my own workplace, my sanctuary. I backed away quietly, the file forgotten. Did he really think I could have taken it? We'd worked together for over a year. We shared lunches, complained about rainy Mondays, celebrated small library victories. Didn't he know me better than that? I spent the next hour replaying the moments in my head. The quiet man leaving the book, Mrs. Gable calling me over. The short time I was away from the desk. Who else had been in the library? A few students were studying quietly at the back tables. Mr. Henderson was reading the newspaper near the window. Could one of them have slipped past unnoticed? It seemed unlikely, but not impossible. It was certainly more logical than me, Maya, who loved this library more than anything, stealing from it. Trying to regain some control, I decided to approach Ben directly, but casually. During a lull, I walked over to where he was sorting periodicals. Then I began, keeping my voice steady, about that book. Did you happen to notice anyone acting strangely around the front desk before you came out of the staff room? Anyone lingering? He looked up, his expression guarded. No, Maya. I didn't see anything unusual. Like I said, it's strange. He paused, then added, I just hope it turns up. It seemed really valuable, and Mrs. Evans will be upset. He turned back to see his magazines, a clear signal that the conversation was over. His short response, the slight emphasis on valuable, felt like another small wall going up between us. My mind raced. Does he think I took it? Why would he? We're friends. The thought echoed, bouncing off the uncomfortable silence that now filled the space where our easy friendship used to be. This wasn't just about a missing book anymore. It felt like my character, my trustworthiness, was being questioned by someone I considered a friend. Just before closing time, Mrs. Evans called both Ben and me into her office. Her face was serious, lines of worry etched around her eyes. About this donated book, she began, her gaze shifting between me and Ben. It's concerning that it disappeared from the counter. Maya, you were the last one to see it. Yes, Mrs. Evans, I confirmed, trying to keep my voice from trembling. I left it there, only for a few minutes, while I assisted Mrs. Gable. And Ben, you arrived shortly after. That's right, Ben said quietly. Mrs. Evans sighed. Okay, we need to handle this properly. I need both of you to write down exactly what you saw and did this afternoon regarding the donation. We'll have to make a formal report about the missing item. A formal report. The words hung in the air, making everything feel heavier, more official, and much worse. The shadow of suspicion felt darker now, pressing in. As I nodded numbly, avoiding Ben's gaze, I knew this wasn't going to simply blow over. The trust I valued so much felt fragile, almost broken, and the path ahead looked uncertain and worrying. Writing the report felt strange, like trying to capture a shadow. I detailed everything. The man's brief appearance, unwrapping the beautiful book, placing it on the counter, Mrs. Gable's request, the few minutes I spent helping her, and my return to find the book gone. I included Ben's arrival moments. Later, I read it over, ensuring it was accurate and clear. It felt inadequate though. It explained what happened, but not how or why the book vanished. The next morning, the atmosphere in the library was still thick with unspoken tension. Ben was polite but distant, and I found myself avoiding his gaze just as much as he seemed to avoid mine. Around mid-morning, Mrs. Evans asked me to come into her office. Ben was already out front, handling the desk. My heart pounded as I walked the short distance, the floorboards seeming to creak louder than usual. Mrs. Evans closed the door behind me and gestured for me to sit. Her expression wasn't angry, but it was deeply serious, and her eyes held a questioning look that made me feel pinned down. "Maya," she began, folding her hands on the desk. "I've read your report. Thank you for being detailed." She paused. "I need to ask you a few more things, just to be absolutely sure we understand the situation." I nodded, gripping my hands together in my lap. "Of course, Mrs. Evans. You're certain you left the book directly on the main counter?" she asked. Her voice even. "Yes. Right near the edge, closest to the staff side," I confirmed. My mind flashed back to the worn leather, the faded gold letters. "And you didn't perhaps move it slightly? Maybe put it on a shelf underneath, intending to secure it properly after helping Mrs. Gable?" I felt a flush creep up my neck. It felt like she was suggesting I was careless, or worse, forgetful to the point of incompetence. "No, Mrs. Evans," I said, trying to keep my voice steady and respectful. I remember distinctly leaving it on the counter. I knew it was valuable, and I only planned to be away for a moment. I wouldn't have put it somewhere less visible without making a note or telling someone. I took a breath, needing her to understand. I love working here. I love the books, and I respect the library and its collections deeply. I would never be careless with a donation, especially one that seemed so special. Mrs. Evans watched me closely as I spoke. She seemed to weigh my words. "I appreciate your dedication, Maya. That's why this is so puzzling." She leaned back slightly. "Think carefully about those few minutes you were with Mrs. Gable. Did anyone else approach the front desk area? Did you hear anything?" I closed my eyes, trying to reconstruct the scene again. The quiet aisle, the smell of old paper in the history section, Mrs. Gable reaching for her bag. Her bag. Suddenly, a specific detail surfaced in my memory, sharp and clear. "Mrs. Gable," I said, my eyes opening. She had a large tote bag. With her, the canvas one she always carries. It was quite full that day. She was returning several books. I pictured her standing near the counter just before she called me over, gathering her things. And she was looking for a local history book for her grandson. That's what I helped her reach. My mind raced, connecting the pieces. Mrs. Gable, slightly flustered, managing a large, overflowing bag right near the counter where the small donated book sat. Could it have happened? Could the donated book have accidentally been swept into her bag along with her own returns as she gathered everything up? It seemed like such a simple, almost clumsy explanation. A possibility, not a certainty, but the first logical explanation that didn't involve theft or deliberate action. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over me. Relief, because it offered a potential solution. that didn't point fingers at me or anyone sinister, but also intense hesitation. Mrs. Gable was a sweet elderly woman, a long-time patron, suggesting she might have accidentally taken a valuable book, even without meaning to, felt awkward and potentially accusatory. What if I was wrong? What if I embarrassed her, or worse, offended her? She represented the community I loved serving. What is it, Maya? Mrs. Evans prompted gently, noticing the shift in my expression. I hesitated, biting my lip. It's just a thought. Probably nothing, I stammered. Maya, Mrs. Evans said, her tone firm but fair. Right now, any possibility is worth considering. We need to find that book. If you thought of something, please tell me, taking another deep breath. I finally voiced the idea that had just formed. Well, Mrs. Gable had her big bag, and she was gathering her returned books near the counter just before she called me. The donated book was small. Is it possible, just possible, that it might have accidentally gotten mixed in with her things, swept into her bag by mistake? As the words left my mouth, there was a light knock on the office door. It opened, and Ben stood there, holding a stack of papers. He looked from Mrs. Evans to me, his expression immediately becoming concerned as he likely sensed the serious atmosphere. Sorry, he said. I just needed Mrs. Evans to sign these. Is everything all right? The tension in the small office instantly tripled. There I was, having just suggested a kind old lady might have accidentally walked off with a valuable book, and Ben, the colleague whose trust I felt I'd lost, had just walked in. The question of what to do next hung heavy in the air, caught in the sudden silence. The silence in Mrs. Evans's office stretched for a long moment after Ben entered. He looked from me to our manager, his brow furrowed. Is something wrong? He asked again, his earlier suspicion seemingly replaced by genuine concern, now that he saw my obvious distress and Mrs. Evans' serious face. Mrs. Evans looked at me, then addressed Ben calmly. Maya was just explaining a possibility regarding the missing book. Ben, come in and close the door. Ben stepped inside, still holding his papers, looking uncertain. Mrs. Evans quickly summarised my thought process. Maya recalled helping Mrs. Gable near the counter just before the book was noticed missing. She thinks it's possible, just possible, that the small donated book might have accidentally gotten swept into Mrs. Gable's large tote bag with her returns. I watched Ben's face closely. His eyes widened slightly in surprise. He glanced at me, and for the first time since yesterday, his expression wasn't guarded or suspicious. It was thoughtful. He seemed to be picturing the scene, perhaps remembering Mrs. Gable and her often overflowing bag himself. He didn't immediately dismiss the idea. It's a delicate situation, Mrs. Evans continued, looking back at me. Mrs. Gable is a valued member of our library community. We can't make accusations, but, she added, her gaze firming, we also need to explore every reasonable possibility to recover the donated book. Maya, do you feel comfortable making a polite phone call? My heart fluttered nervously. Calling Mrs. Gable felt incredibly awkward, but it also felt like the only logical, honest next step. Blaming her wasn't the goal. Finding the book was. And deep down, I felt this explanation made more sense than any other. It felt human. Yes, I agreed, my voice quiet but steady. I think the honest approach is best. I can call her and just ask if she might have picked up an extra item by mistake. Mrs. Evans nodded, looking relieved. Good. Use the phone here. She pushed the office phone towards me. Ben stood near the door, watching, his expression now unreadable, but no longer hostile. I felt a small measure of comfort, knowing he heard the whole suggestion, that it wasn't some secret theory I cooked up. My fingers trembled slightly as I dialed Mrs. Gable's number from the library records. She answered on the third ring, her voice warm and familiar. Hello. Hello, Mrs. Gable. This is Maya from the library, I began, trying to sound calm and friendly. Oh, hello, Maya dear. Is everything all right? Yes, everything's fine, thank you, I quickly reassured her. I'm calling about something a little unusual that happened yesterday afternoon. We had a small old book donated, and it seems to have gone missing from our front counter right around the time you were leaving. I paused, taking a breath. You had quite a few books with you yesterday in your large cloth bag, and we were just wondering, is there any tiny chance an extra book might have accidentally slipped in with your things when you were gathering them up? It was a small, leather-bound book. There was a pause on the other end. Then Mrs. Gable sounded surprised. Oh my goodness, missing. Dear me. Let me just check my bag. I haven't even unpacked it properly since yesterday. I got distracted when I got home. I heard some rustling sounds in the background. My stomach twisted with anxiety. What if it wasn't there? What if I'd made things worse? Then Mrs. Gable came back on the line, her voice filled with astonishment and embarrassment. Oh, Maya, you won't believe this. It is here, tucked right in between my novels. Oh, I am so terribly sorry. I must have swept it right off the counter without even noticing. I was so flustered trying to manage everything. Oh dear, a huge wave of relief washed over me, so strong I almost felt dizzy. Oh, Mrs. Gable, thank you so much for checking. It's completely understandable, an easy mistake to make. We were just so worried about it. I'll bring it back right away, she insisted. Thank you, that would be wonderful. No rush, whenever you can, I said, smiling into the phone. After I hung up, I looked at Mrs. Evans, my relief evident. She is hit. It was an accident, just like we thought it might be. Mrs. Evans let out a long breath, a smile finally breaking through her worried expression. Oh, thank goodness. Maya, thank you. That was handled very well. Thoughtfully and politely, I glanced over at Ben. He was leaning against the door frame, and he looked genuinely remorseful. He stepped forward as Mrs. Evans turned to her desk. Maya, he said quietly, meeting my eyes directly this time. I owe you an apology, a big one. My heart softened. Hearing him say it meant a lot. I was so worried about the book and what Mrs. Evans would say. He continued, looking down for a moment before meeting my gaze again. It seemed valuable, and when it just vanished after you were there, I jumped to conclusions. It wasn't fair to you. I know you love this library, and I should have trusted you. I'm really sorry I made you feel doubted. Thank you, Ben, I said softly. The knot of anxiety and hurt that had been sitting in my chest since yesterday finally began to loosen. I understand you were worried. It was a stressful situation. A little while later, Mrs. Gable arrived, breathless and apologetic, clutching the precious book. Mrs. Evans reassured her kindly that it was an understandable mix-up, thanking her profusely for returning it. The crisis was over. As Ben and I worked side by side later that day, the awkwardness began to fade, replaced by a tentative return to our usual friendly dynamic. We even shared a small laugh over a misplaced book request. Things weren't instantly back to normal. The memory of the suspicion, the shadows of trust, lingered slightly, but the air was clear. That evening, walking home, I reflected on the past 2 days. Trust, I realised, is a strong thing, but it can be fragile when faced with fear and misunderstanding. Those shadows of doubt had felt so real, so dark, but bringing the possibility, even an awkward one, into the light and communicating openly had chased them away. It taught me that jumping to conclusions helps no one, and giving people, friends, colleagues, even patrons with overflowing bags, the benefit of the doubt is important. It also taught me that sometimes, even when it's hard, speaking up and seeking the truth rationally and kindly is the best way forward. The library felt like my sanctuary again, perhaps even more so now, knowing that honesty could restore the light,